281. Snape's Potions Room. In bustling London, there were always a few small, overlooked places, so forgotten by the gentlemen of Downing Street that they seemed to belong to another age, to dust and neglect. Number 19 Spinner's End was one of them. A small brown wooden house that creaked and sighed like everything inside, dated from another century. Harry stepped quietly into the front room and took it in. Old furniture sagged in the corners. Newspapers had yellowed to the color of tea, photographs lay dimmed under dust, and a tall grandfather clock stood against the wall like something from an antique shop. It was a living room that begged to be forgotten. Snape's gaze flicked to Harry's face, and for a moment, the surface of his thoughts seemed to multiply like mushrooms after rain. Once, long ago, he had dreamed of inviting someone with the same emerald eyes into a room like this. That invitation had never been extended. Harry felt a similar wistfulness settle in his chest. Since his first potions lesson at Hogwarts, he had never imagined he would one day be in Snape's home, and certainly not for an extended stay. Dumbledore's instructions replayed in his mind. Whether he learned anything in these 2 weeks or not, he must go back to Aunt Petunia's house on Privet Drive and remain there until the term began. Silence hung between them until a green flame winked to life in the grate. "Sorry I'm late," said Eno, sweeping his gaze around the room. He took in the shabby, cramped downstairs and then looked puzzled. It didn't make sense that Snape would have Harry sleep down here. "You weren't told a time," Harry said with a smile. "So how could you be late?" "You never know," Eno replied, smirking. "After all, you two were waiting for me." His eyes moved again, this time up the narrow staircase. Snape rose and led the way. The wooden stairs complained underfoot as they climbed. At the top, Snape pushed open a door, and Eno admitted he'd underestimated his host. It looked at first like another small room, but the space within was many times larger than it should have been. Snape's use of the undetectable extension charm was impressive. The room was an expert's den, racks of bottles and jars, brass cauldrons, neat stacks of brand-new glass vials, and shelves groaning with ingredient jars, roots, talons, preserved organs, and specimens too strange to name. This was where Snape brewed. "Professor, you're having Harry stay here?" Eno asked, unsure. The place smelled strongly of potions, and that alone would be enough to put some people off. "The security here is high," Snape said, unusually candid. "That's what matters." Eno shrugged. When safety was on the line, comfort mattered less. Then, under Harry's astonished stare, Snape raised his wand and a clear, crystalline little house shimmered into being in the middle of the room. It looked like a square mushroom cottage out of a children's tale, no more than 10 square meters inside. Harry watched it form, a transparent little structure that seemed to glow faintly. Snape's conjuration was done wandlessly and without a single spoken word, an elemental, economical transfiguration that revealed just how much he could do. Eno couldn't help but be impressed. "I didn't expect," he began, then grinned. "Harry, your new house is ready. Only 3 sickles." He jabbed a thumb at the mushroom house. "If you get cold, light the fireplace. My ice and snow aren't that easy to melt, so you don't have to worry." The ice and snow sheath was, in fact, a protective insulation conjured to give Harry a proper night's sleep. If the Horcrux was tugging at him through dreams, if his nightmares about turning into a snake and other symptoms were connected to that dreadful piece of soul, then Dumbledore and Snape were both rightly cautious. Harry had been stubborn, too. If he had mentioned the first headaches and dreams earlier, perhaps things would have gone differently. But there was no use blaming now. The little mushroom cottage sat semicircular in the center of the larger potions room. It was about 5 or 6 meters across and 3 meters high. Harry pushed open the small rounded door, and a cool breath washed over him. He was still in a summer shirt. Eno snapped his fingers. "Incendio!" A small flame hovered, casting a warm light inside the ice shell and raising the temperature until Harry felt comfortable. Magic let ice and fire coexist in perfect balance. "If you need any furniture, just transfigure it," Eno called. "You're not staying permanently. Make do." He produced a bag of Bertie Bott's every flavor beans and handed it to Harry with a teasing bow before stepping out. Harry looked at the bag in his hand and felt the urge to laugh. It was obvious what the sweets were really for, but he couldn't imagine using tiny beans as transfiguration material. For a heartbeat, he almost called after Eno to confess that he'd copied all his transfiguration homework, mindlessly, then thought better of it. Outside the mushroom house, Eno fell in step beside Snape. "Professor, I've done what I can. If you need anything else, right." "Good." Snape's nod was slight. He reached into his coat and drew out a small bottle of a golden, shimmering potion. Felix Felicis glittered like sunlight in liquid form, unmistakable. Eno's eyes widened. He'd once been obsessed with the idea of brewing Felix Felicis, spending hours processing ingredients for it in the potions room in the hope of brewing it himself one day. Then his studies and other pursuits had pushed potions to the sidelines, but the sight of the familiar potion still made him feel a pull of nostalgia. "Professor, I don't need Felix Felicis," he said, shaking his head. He would not take what was not his to accept. Snape had offered, but the matter was not one for gifts. Snape's offer was declined, but as Eno refused, something shifted in the older man's face. A faint, almost imperceptible smile ghosted across Snape's features. 282. Time flies. England in August. Time, like fine sand, slipped through his fingers, silent yet undeniably real. In the cottage in Hogsmeade on the second floor, Eno was methodically sorting the letters spread across his desk. Since his last trip to Spinner's End, more than half a month had passed without much fanfare. Time had moved on, and in that span many things had happened. Some touched him directly, others were beyond his influence. When it came to Harry, for instance, he had done everything within his power out of respect for Snape and Dumbledore. Whether Harry could master occlumency or what path he would choose remained Harry's own fate. Sometimes the world felt like a vast library of stories, every person the protagonist of their own tale. On the study table, the letters had been split into two piles, completed and pending. They looked less like correspondence and more like a list of things to be done. As he worked, Eno realized that with time and age, the easy quiet of his life had slipped away and small, persistent tasks had gathered. This summer, in particular, had brought one complicated job after another, recording albums for LAA, setting up production of the film mirrors on Briony Island, drafting a reply to the Order of Merlin. He picked up only the Order of Merlin reply and set it casually to the side. A lot had changed quietly over the last fortnight. Once the mail was sorted, it became obvious that the cumbersome problems that had loomed over him were gradually being resolved. The Quidditch World Cup concert and the film mirror production were both moving forward. A week earlier, he had recorded 3 different theme songs for LAA, and he'd handed the follow-up negotiations to Old Flint to take to the ministry. With the only unfinished letter left on the desk, Eno rose and stretched, enjoying the rare feeling of being unburdened. Outside the cottage, there was no such stillness. Early August had filled England with a taut anticipation. As the Quidditch World Cup approached, the Ministry of Magic ran at full capacity. The Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, the Department of Magical Games and Sports, the Department of International Magical Cooperation. Save perhaps the Department of Mysteries, there was hardly anyone idle. The crowds of foreign wizards pouring into Britain now outnumbered natives, and at Fudge's instruction the ministry had even reached out to the Muggle Prime Minister to coordinate. In London, Mr. Granger sat watching the morning news. The presenter was seriously announcing the latest arrivals, a grand circus touring England, renowned magicians gathering from abroad. Mr. Granger, who loved sporting events, turned to Hermione with a hopeful question. "Hermione, should I pack camping gear? A strong flashlight? Maybe a generator? You know your mother and I can't cook with magic." Hermione folded the newspaper and smiled. "Don't worry, Dad. I'll take care of everything. If we need anything from home, we can bring the little tent from last summer." The disappointment in Mr. Granger's face was brief but real, once he had felt needed in every corner of the household. Now there wasn't much he could do. The Wizarding Bank had capped how many pounds could be exchanged, so even financial help was limited. Mrs. Granger squeezed his hand, gentle and practical. "Be glad for her, not sad. Hermione has her own life. You can't look after her forever, and she'll find someone who can." Her eyes flicked to the paper in Hermione's hands. She had noticed the boy in the photo on the front page. Meanwhile, in Hogsmeade's Three Broomsticks, laughter had been spilling out all afternoon. A large film mirror hung in the main room, looping old Tom and Jerry sketches to the delight of the clientele. The castle's students might have been a little bored by cartoons, but Hogsmeade's regulars, many of them adults and a smattering of foreign visitors, found the animations irresistible. As the owner, Madame Rosmerta watched the day's takings and then turned to the young man beside her with a teasing sigh. "I don't know what you were thinking," she said, "but this thing is going to be everywhere before long. You'll be rich." Eno shrugged. "It's not just me. There are a lot of people involved. When we move the product beyond England, things might not go as smoothly." "Don't worry so much," she waved him off. "People chase profit. They'll handle what needs handling." Eno glanced at the crowded common room and thought of Diagon Alley. With the Brioni Island Alchemy Factory starting production, the first wave of promotional mirrors had quietly hit the market. Now shopkeepers, whether in Diagon Alley or Hogsmeade, were hanging film mirrors in their windows sized to fit each storefront. "That Tom fellow will probably do even better in Diagon Alley than here," Madame Rosmerta said, then changed the subject. "It's hard to believe Fudge agreed to add a new segment before the World Cup match, a stage for 100,000 people." Merlin. Fudge had agreed, Eno knew, because this wasn't merely a performance. If everything went right, the event could change things. A genuine phoenix born in front of 100,000 witnesses would be a spectacle no one could ignore, and Fudge's name would be etched into the record for having authorized it. After all, Britain would be the first to do such a thing. British Ministry of Magic, classification level, ex-flobberworm appearance. The flobberworm is a thick, brown, worm-like creature, growing up to about 10 inches long. It favors inactivity. Both ends of its body look similar, and either end can bite at plants. It secretes a slimy mucus, from which it takes its name. Habits. Flobberworms live in damp ditches. Their preferred food is lettuce, though they will eat most kinds of plants. 283. Slightly delayed today. Sorry, everyone. Xiao has just finished writing, but it still needs another revision. Today's update will be a little late, but it will be ready by 9 p.m. at the latest. 284. Interesting campsite at the Three Broomsticks. Eno sat at the bar, leisurely sipping grass juice. Down in Diagon Alley, the leaky cauldron was thronged. As the face of the alley, it was a riot of color and costume. Different skins, different faces, different robes, as if wizards from every corner of the globe had poured into London. Some had come early to sightsee, others would arrive at the last minute by portkey, but whatever their route, one thing united them all: their love of Quidditch. By August, the weather had turned oppressively hot, and convective storms rolled through from time to time. The brief downpours, rarely lasting more than a quarter of an hour, did nothing to cool things. If anything, they just made the air thicker and more humid, at least in crowded areas like London and Diagon Alley. Out in St. Catchpole Village, beneath a high moon, a cool evening breeze swept the open fields. Knee-high grass rippled like waves, and in that pleasant quiet stood a crooked house with warm lights spilling from irregular windows, twinkling like distant stars. The borough looked particularly cozy. "I can't believe it. Bulgaria actually made the finals," Arthur exclaimed again, unable to remember how many times he'd already said it. "Arthur, if you have time for Quidditch chat, why don't you take a turn at the ministry and keep an eye on things? Percy hasn't been home for 3 days, Mrs. Weasley chided, glancing at the clock. The hands still stubbornly pointed toward work. She fretted in that way only a mother could, concerned for her son and proud of his industry at once. "It's fine. Percy's with Barty. I'm relieved. Besides, they're on the front line during the World Cup," she added, trying to soothe herself. Arthur understood. Young men threw themselves into their careers and ambitions. Mrs. Weasley, however, sighed. She wanted her children to do well, but not to drive themselves too hard. Night had fallen, and she still wondered whether Percy had eaten dinner. In Diagon Alley, inside a private shop, Percy stood holding a crystal-clear wine glass surrounded by well-dressed young wizards. A small banquet was in full swing. "Everything's arranged, then. I'll take my leave. Enjoy yourselves," Draco announced, setting down his glass and rising with careful composure. "Don't be such a spoil sport, Master Malfoy." Marcus teased, the others around them smirking at the jibe. I ought to go home, Draco replied coolly. I've fulfilled my part. The shop, the venue, the seed money. The rest is up to you. Under the lamp, the pale sheen of his platinum hair caught the light. His calm cadence and even expression made people think of the older Malfoys. In their minds, the elder Malfoy was not Lucius, but the family patriarch, a man many admired. A slightly hoarse female voice drifted through the group. In that case, I'll be off too. Give me a few days and you'll see Nocturnally change. It was Mina Burke, a Slytherin prefect who had graduated 2 years earlier. When people thought of Nocturnally, they thought of Burke. If you thought about smuggling, you thought of Abbott for Wands Ollivander. But Nocturnally and Burke were inseparable. You lot are really something, Marcus muttered, sneaking off right after business was finished. These two were odd company. Percy felt a twinge of frustration, not because they had a right to leave, but because it highlighted how unfair things could seem. The others in the room were members of the Sacred 28, while the Weasleys had always been on the outside. Still, Percy believed the Weasleys could change their prospects. He believed it especially after George and Fred's work improving the film mirror. If the film mirror was a ship, the twins were important officers, and he intended to be their spokesman in society affairs. Sometimes you had to fight for things in person. Thinking that, he lifted his glass again and resumed his practiced smile. Time did not slow for anyone. Within a week, thanks to the Ministry of Magic's tireless efforts, a stadium with 100,000 capacity had been constructed. Although the match was still days away, many wizards had already set up camps near the venue, and the ministry was relieved. If everyone gathered here, there was less chance someone would act recklessly and expose the magical world to muggles. Around the stadium, they had laid a huge muggle-repelling charm, extending for miles so no muggle would spot anything out of the ordinary for tens of miles. On the wide plain, thousands upon thousands of tents rose like a riot of flowers. Streamers fluttered everywhere, and crowds hummed. Most of the pitched tents were uniform, like a tidy bed of blooms, but many showcased eccentricity. Chimneys, small windmills, sleds propped at the side, even tiny fountains crowning tent tops. People decorated however they pleased. Eno wandered into the noisy camp and felt like he'd stepped into a medieval market. Vendors pushed carts that called to mind the candy trolleys on the Hogwarts Express, only there were more of them, and their wares were richer. Meat pies, chocolates, souvenirs, binoculars, shamrock badges from Ireland, miniature Quidditch figures. Every stall felt like a magical blind box. You never knew who the seller might be or what treasures lay inside. In minutes, he passed a burly white man pushing a vodka cart and a black girl whose stall was hung with bone ornaments. There were endless lively and curious sights, but what surprised him most was how many people were using film mirrors to record events, something he hadn't expected to see so widely used at the campsite. 285. Purebloods. Following the trend of interests. In the camp, after chatting with a French girl who had a thick accent, Eno finally learned the latest about the film mirrors. Draco Malfoy and Marcus Flint, along with a number of other pureblood families, had quietly conspired to introduce a large shipment of finished film mirrors to the market, half sold and half given away. The French girl, for example, had bought some love potions from Extraordinary Potions and was told she'd won a lucky draw. After paying 10 sickles, she inexplicably walked away with a 15-inch film mirror. It was said to record continuously for over 3 hours and preserve the images for at least 10 years. Eno's first reaction was dumbfounded. Giving a girl who bought a love potion a piece of filming equipment was simply outrageous. Absurd as it sounded, it also showed the purebloods' execution. After the dinner at Malfoy Manor, Eno had relinquished his authority over Briony Island. All developments there would now be carried out according to the shareholders' decisions. The current progress hadn't disappointed. If anything, it had produced pleasant surprises. Limited-time filming was brilliant marketing, turning a reusable item into something treated like a disposable novelty. Time slipped by. 3 days flew past, and Eno felt the charm of magic more keenly than ever. Wizards had gathered from all over the world, bringing experiences that neither Hogwarts nor Diagon Alley could rival. For a moment, he toyed with the idea of buying a small island and turning it into a theme park for wizards, but that remained a plan. The urgent task was the opening concert. As the date drew near, Old Flint sent a reply from the Ministry of Magic. The chosen song would be The Cup of Life as the theme for 1998. Eno wasn't surprised. Among Muggle World Cup anthems, the rousing The Cup of Life was a natural fit. Straightforward, celebratory, and all about pure passion. Along with the letter, Old Flint had dispatched 10 sets of exquisitely made evening gowns in a variety of styles. The camp's population kept swelling. Remarkable! Sirius Black exclaimed sincerely as he took in the endless sea of tents, with Harry and the Weasleys beside him. Yes, Fudge occasionally has his moments, Arthur agreed, pride in his voice. To Arthur, the scale of the operation, almost like building a temporary city in the wild, stirred a very English kind of emotion. I heard from Ludo when I got the tickets that the ministry probably sold 100,000 tickets, and now it seems there might be even more, Arthur added. 100,000 people. The number stunned everyone, Harry especially, who had once assumed that Diagon Alley and Hogwarts were the heart of the wizarding world. Arthur seemed to notice Harry's reaction. Children, the wizarding world isn't just Hogwarts. There's a vast world beyond. But our priority is to pitch the tent. If all goes well, we'll be here a few days, Arthur interrupted, clapping his hands and glancing skyward. They had left Stothaid Hill that morning, and the sun was nearing noon. There's no need to worry about a tent. Sirius cut in, stopping the bustle. They allocated a plot to me last week, and I had Creature set my tent up already. It'll hold us all. Arthur betrayed a flicker of disappointment, but relented. All right, we'll do as you say. They followed Sirius. As an old pure-blood family, the Blacks' tent wouldn't be pitched in any ordinary spot. In fact, many prestigious households had set up their camps nearest the stadium. Half an hour later, they reached the core of the luxurious area. Where the outermost layer of simple triangular tents looked almost like a slum, this section was more a series of temporary palaces than tents. One especially striking structure rose 4 stories high, an ornate mini-castle with gardens, sundials, fountains, towers, and even white peacocks promenading the lawns. The opulence made most of the Weasleys and Harry feel an odd discomfort, while Sirius seemed perfectly at home. Only Fred and George appeared unfazed, even strangely confident. Inside that spacious palace-like tent, Eno lay back on a soft sofa. After lunch, a short nap was the best choice. "Aren't you nervous?" Draco asked. He'd known the evening's match schedule for some time. He wasn't hiding it. "What's there to be nervous about?" Eno murmured, half asleep, eyes half open. "Don't look at the crowd," he added softly. "You only ever have to face yourself." "Only face yourself?" Draco repeated, thoughtful. "Yes." Eno sat up slightly. "That's what my teacher told me. If you can face yourself calmly, you can face anyone calmly. Even if the whole world is watching, you stay composed." As he spoke, Eno's mind drifted, memories of another world where the Royal Grand Theatre's grandeur rivaled, perhaps even surpassed, what he now saw. The story of his life had been altered beyond recognition, but he felt no regret. A different story simply meant a different protagonist. Once, he had feared change because it robbed him of security. Now, if Harry couldn't carry the flag, Eno wouldn't mind stepping forward as a cameo protagonist. After all, it was just a story playing out in a corner of the British Isles. Sleep came over him again. Draco watched, and for a moment a bright flash crossed his features, an understanding or a decision, then vanished. In that brief instant, Draco looked unusually composed. Clad in a sharp suit, he hardly seemed like a 4th year at all. Ludo turned, and seeing Eno felt tears spring to his eyes. Thank Merlin. You haven't forgotten. You haven't shown up. I've been scared to death. Sorry, I overslept a little, Eno said quietly. That's a minor matter. A minor matter, Ludo repeated, still shaking. Merlin knew how anyone could oversleep, and his fear didn't help. You've got 1 hour to prepare. At my signal, the venue staff will play the accompaniment in 12 sections at once. Remember, a red firework spell. Welcome to the 422nd Quidditch World Cup. Thunderous applause rolled through the arena. But before the match, we have prepared a small surprise for you. We hope you like it. Ludo was not a natural master of ceremonies. His awkward opening placed a huge burden on Eno. Like a 30-second ad before a much-anticipated show, the crowd could easily turn impatient. The mood across the stadium was subtly strained. But along the way, I have raced the wind countless times, soared with the clouds. What I chase isn't just the golden snitch, but the undying fire of struggle in my chest. But isn't a match just about catching the snitch? The child asked. Yes, a match is about the snitch, but Quidditch is not. What is Quidditch, then? The child demanded. It is the never give up, never compromise spirit of wizards. When wizards face misfortune and setback, they remember Quidditch. They remember the struggle they once knew on the pitch. The silver phantoms dissolved, and the sky cleared to reveal scenes of another age. Wizards battling dragons, giants, dementors, and writhing venomous tentacula. Whatever the foe, wizards gripped their wands and fought, refusing to yield. The images vanished as a burst of red fireworks blossomed and rhythmic music filled the stadium. Over the music, a voice boomed, carrying to every ear, "The Cup of Life. This is the one." Then a surprising beat dropped, a Muggle song from the future, arriving in England 4 years early. Whatever people had been thinking before, the song swept it away. The beat and simple, spirited lyrics stirred a raw, competitive yearning in everyone, a collective hunger for victory and the old, fierce joy of battle. As the chorus rose, Eno felt something respond in him. He looked up and saw a faint flame hundreds of feet above the arena. Within that flame, he recognized an old feeling, the fire of Prometheus he had seen on the Caucasus, a blaze that honored courage, struggle, wisdom, and self-sacrifice. It was the saving flame of legend. Under the converging emotions of 100,000 wizards, the little flame swelled. A phantom of a phoenix unfurled, its wingspan over 200 feet. Rather than inspiring fear, the enormous bird brought a sense of comfort and awe. With a long, melodious cry, Eno's figure rose into the air. The goal had been achieved. It was time to withdraw. He imagined that, when the uproar died down tomorrow, many would be glad to share whatever scandal might follow. Below, the spectacle continued. The silver whale and the red phoenix drifted apart, and the arena's excitement reignited as the Bulgarian team made a dramatic entrance. The Bulgarian players flew in a triangular formation around the pitch, and on the stadium 1,000 bright red banners unfurled, echoing their passage. Close behind came the Irish team, sweeping out in a green shamrock formation. Red and green flags snapped in the wind, thousands of colors alternating, and the stadium became a roaring sea of celebration. The entrance of both teams was flawless. They not only filled the void left after the last performance, but lifted the atmosphere in the stadium to another level. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the Bulgaria team is entering first. They are Dimitrov, Ivanova, Zograf, Levski, Volkanov, and Volkov. Ludo's voice rang out, and the Bulgarian players streaked across the pitch so quickly they became a blur. And finally, his voice climbed with excitement. The Seeker, Crumb. The roar that followed nearly shook the stadium apart. Even the Irish supporters applauded. A world-class Seeker on the Quidditch World Cup pitch was a superstar returning to his stage. Everyone made room for his brilliance. "He's just amazing," Ron murmured, eyes shining. "Yes, an outstanding Seeker." Arthur agreed. He wasn't optimistic about Bulgaria's chances overall, but Crumb's talent was obvious to everyone. In a box not far from the Weasleys, the Granger family's reactions were mixed. Hermione, after the earlier show, found the pageantry a little dull. Mr. Granger, a staunch sports fan, felt differently. He believed the opening ceremonies were just a warm-up and that the real excitement would come once the match began. In another box, Eno cradled a warm, soft phoenix in his hands and smiled at the two older men across from him. "A real phoenix," he said. "I knew it would work." Newt stood and looked uncharacteristically excited. "Congratulations, Eno, Newt. Your names will be remembered." Dumbledore laughed softly and clapped, his relief and pleasure evident. "Thank you, Professor. But I'd rather be a witness to history than recorded in it. Let Newt have the honors." Eno stroked the bird's wings. A strange feeling of connection rose in him, almost like blood. He wondered if Dumbledore and Fawkes felt the same, but the phoenix in his arms felt utterly magical. If he had to describe it, it was like holding his own child, another version of himself in feathered form. "A witness to history?" Dumbledore repeated, amused. "A phoenix is a witness to history. Fawkes has watched over the Dumbledores for generations." Newt wasn't paying much attention to their banter. His mind was fixed on the newborn phoenix. This one felt different from Fawkes's sacrifice and different from Sparks' courage. Up close, it seemed to combine great sacrifice with fierce bravery, and yet there was something more. "Eno," he said quietly, "this phoenix feels different." Dumbledore's smile flickered, knowing what Newt suspected. Some questions couldn't be asked bluntly, like the workings of Patronuses or certain charms. Eno looked down and answered simply, "I call him Corvus." Unlike Fawkes's vivid crimson, Corvus's color leaned toward the glow of morning, a comforting orange-red warmth. "Corvus?" Newt repeated, tasting the name. He thought of what it suggested, healing, rebirth, and found himself drawn to the bird's eyes, warm, pure, clear, shining like the sun at dawn. Where Fide's birth had been chaotic, Corvus turned his head quietly and met Newt's gaze, as if acknowledging the attention. In that instant, Newt felt transported back to his carefree days at Hogwarts. Eno looked down at the bird, and the affection in his face was unmistakable. Compared to Fide, Corvus seemed beloved in a different way, like a rebellious son versus a beautiful, cherished daughter. Dumbledore watched without a word, utterly at ease. For a moment in that box, time seemed to pause. On the pitch, however, the match raged. Bulgaria and Ireland were playing with everything on the line. Every dive, every maneuver was a full-throttle effort. It was a visual feast. Harry, binoculars pressed to his eyes, watched intently. He'd been Gryffindor's Seeker and had seen countless school matches, but nothing he'd experienced at Hogwarts prepared him for this. The difference between House Cup Quidditch and the professional league wasn't merely a gap, it was a chasm. Others were stunned too. The intensity of the play left most of the Wizards awestruck, and because they were wizards, many of the troubling details slid past them unnoticed. The same could not be said for muggles. "Are they on stimulants or something?" Mr. Granger muttered, horrified. He'd seen players race for the quaffle and risk head-on collisions, barely avoiding catastrophic falls with inches to spare. The danger was life-threatening. Stimulants? Hermione's brow went tight. She hated any hint of cheating. That's impossible. Felix Felicis was banned before the match, and potion masters would detect anything. With today's skill, they can identify a potion by smell alone. Mrs. Granger piped up with a different theory. Maybe it was the song. Eno's song earlier. There was something about it that made me want to win. It even gave me the urge to enter the community cooking creative competition. At the words, community cooking creative competition, Hermione and Mr. Granger exchanged the same helpless look and a flicker of dread. "What's that expression for?" Mrs. Granger protested, a little offended. "I was only saying. And anyway, I'm not going to develop new dishes anymore." She looked hurt. After all, her experiment, lamb kidneys stewed with tomatoes and honey, had been intended to preserve the ingredients' true flavors, even if it hadn't been to everyone's taste. She hadn't forced anyone to finish a serving. So why the frightened looks from her husband and daughter? The match was still underway. Less than half an hour in, Ireland had already piled up 70 points with relentless momentum. Bulgaria still had none. To anyone who didn't understand Quidditch, it looked like a massacre. Fans who knew the game, however, saw what was really happening. Bulgaria had opened with a 5-guard-1 plan. 5 outfield players, 3 chasers and 2 beaters, leaving the keeper out of the equation, were there less to score than to shield Crumb. They would try for the quaffle if they could, but their priority was to protect Crumb and give him the best chance to catch the golden snitch before the point gap reached 150, ending the match with a sudden, decisive strike. The tactic could have worked if the opposition hadn't been so strong. Ireland, also a top-tier side, immediately countered. Their seeker couldn't be expected to outmatch Crumb, so they countered with points. They aimed to widen the lead beyond 150 before the snitch appeared. Both teams were playing their calculations, and the crowd of 100,000 loved it. 2 lightning-fast strategies colliding made for fireworks, and the pre-match tensions only amplified them. Yet one place in the stadium remained calm, the private box. "Professor, do you have any plans once school starts?" Eno asked casually. The Goblet of Fire had altered much, but it had not changed the inevitability of certain dangers, and Anna was curious about Dumbledore's next moves. "Once term begins?" Dumbledore's brow lifted in surprise, then softened into one of his rare smiles, as if remembering something. "The future is not set in stone. It depends on the diviner's choices. Still, I'll share what I can. The Goblet of Fire is no trivial matter. It stands for the honor of the 3 great schools of Europe." He spoke quietly. Eno listened. Newt, the master of magical creatures, hunched over paper across the box, writing so fast he barely looked up. The stadium roared beyond the glass, but inside it was surprisingly peaceful. When Dumbledore's words trailed off, Eno didn't rush to reply. The old headmaster was plainly not inclined to abandon Harry. If anything, he was trying to set up an opportunity for the boy to face Tom Riddle himself. Faced with such devotion, Eno felt both helpless and moved. It brought to mind a familiar moral dilemma, the trolley problem posed by philosopher Philippa Foot in 1971. A runaway trolley threatens 5 people tied on its track. Switching it to another track will save them but kill 1 person instead. Do you save 5 at the cost of 1? For Eno, Dumbledore's decision was a strange answer to that paradox. He would not coldly switch tracks and sacrifice the innocent. Nor would he accept the 5 deaths as inevitable. He chose, in effect, to throw himself between the trolley and its victims and use every power at his disposal to stop it. To a muggle that might sound impossible, but to a wizard the very point of magic is to make the impossible real. Moved, Eno finally said, "Professor, I can't promise everything, but as long as I'm at Hogwarts, I will do everything in my power to keep the castle safe." "I know," Dumbledore said, unperturbed. He seemed unsurprised by the pledge. Eno smiled, accepting that the headmaster would keep his secrets. Everyone had their burdens. Outside, the game grew ever more fierce. Bulgaria's tenacity showed. Once the score reached 120-0 and their initial plan had clearly failed, they didn't collapse. They shifted tactics and joined the scramble for the quaffle. The change paid off. After a brutal exchange, they finally put points on the board, making it 130-10. For many, though, Ireland's lead already felt insurmountable. "The lads from Bulgaria are brave and tenacious," Fudge declared with obvious relish. The Bulgarian minister, by contrast, looked sour. If they had switched strategy earlier, when down only 70, the match might still have been theirs. Now, trailing by 130, it would have been smarter to burn their ships and throw everyone into helping Crumb find the snitch. This late struggle seemed less like a meaningful comeback than an attempt to stretch the game out a little longer. Then Ludo's voice cut through the din. "Look, Lynch has spotted the golden snitch. Ireland must have known where it was all along." On the pitch, the Bulgarian players didn't need the commentator to tell them the truth. They all felt toyed with. Fate, perhaps, had other plans. 2 hours after the first whistle, Krum executed a perfect Ronsky feint, fooled Lynch, and caught the golden snitch amid a thunder of cheers. The final whistle went 170-160. Ireland had won the 422nd Quidditch World Cup by 10 points. Many Bulgarian supporters were furious at the narrowness of the margin. Given how dominant Ireland had been early on, some thought the final score was an injustice. Others recognized it as a merciful compromise. A collapse would only have widened the gap further, and finishing with dignity was preferable. Still, discontent spread through parts of the crowd, and restlessness grew. The Bulgarian minister glanced toward Fudge, bewildered by the Home Secretary's easy smile. If the mood in the stands turned violent, a riot could become a real danger. Fudge, however, only smiled more confidently. At that moment, the private box door was pushed open from the outside. The Bulgarian Minister of Magic wore a look of sudden recognition. Though a foreigner, he knew the three wizards before him. Albus Dumbledore, the greatest white wizard of the 20th century and headmaster of Hogwarts. Newt Scamander, master of magical creatures, and the young man who had been singing at the start of the match, perched on the whale. 10 minutes earlier, as the match was winding down, Newt, shy and anxious in crowds, had wanted to leave early. As the three prepared to say their goodbyes, Crumb made a brilliant catch of the golden snitch. The stadium's atmosphere shifted instantly, and all three of them, as prominent wizards, noticed. Dumbledore could not stand by and do nothing. To prevent the tragedy of the original story, Eno, holding Corvus, followed him closely. 2 of the 3 hospitality boxes were suddenly vacant, and Newt naturally chose that moment to go. He glanced first at Dumbledore, then at Corvus in Eno's arms, and, as if struck by a small private amusement, reached into his pocket. Inside was a precious bundle of phoenix feathers, a gift from Fawkes. When the box door opened, Cornelius Fudge's face showed no outward change, but inwardly he breathed with relief. He had known Dumbledore would be at the stadium since early that morning. That knowledge had been why he stayed silent when the first unrest began. Stepping forward now would mean taking responsibility. If appeasement succeeded, he might gain some credit. If it failed, he would be ruined. His hesitation had been meant to put Dumbledore in the lead, and the headmaster did not disappoint. Dumbledore left the box at once and walked to the outer stands, to the open-air viewing terrace by the World Cup trophy. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice, amplified by magic, swept over the whole venue. The effect was nearly incantatory. The crowd, which had been buzzing moments before, stilled. Everyone lifted their telescopes at once. Wands could be set aside during such a match, but telescopes were indispensable. Through them, spectators saw a striking sight. 3 people and 2 phoenixes. Headmaster Dumbledore, Mr. Scamander. Isn't that the young man who was on the whale just now? Recognition spread through the stands, and the earlier agitation dissolved. Dumbledore spoke with that polite gravity people expected of him, representing Hogwarts on a public stage. "First, welcome everyone to England. Thank you to the Bulgarian national team and to the Irish team for a spectacular Quidditch match." Watching Dumbledore calm the crowd, Eno realized tonight's course had clearly shifted. He wasn't sure whether the Dark Mark would appear as in the original tale, but with Dumbledore and Newt present, anything that followed would be suppressed. Even if someone rose from Nurmengard's high tower or stood hand in hand with Voldemort, it wouldn't matter now. His eyes drifted to the two phoenixes. After a careful look, he still thought Corvus the more beautiful. Eno never fully understood why Newt had bothered using Fawkes's feathers to call a phoenix here. If it was to prove the authenticity of a phoenix, it seemed unnecessary. Fawkes and Corvus were obviously different. He decided it was probably just Newt's playful streak. He must have thought it amusing, and so used the precious feathers without hesitation. With Dumbledore's calming words, the stadium fell back into its usual order. The match was over, but the week-long carnival was only beginning. The Quidditch World Cup, held every 4 years, was not abruptly closed. Wizards had traveled thousands of miles. Tents and preparations could not be dismissed so quickly. As the 100,000-odd crowd began to stream out in orderly fashion, the visitors in the hospitality box shifted into more familiar conviviality. Sirius Black stood up, sweeping a grand look over everyone. "All right, kids, the party starts now. Tonight's on me." No, I'll give them pocket money," Mrs. Weasley interrupted briskly. Arthur put a hand on Sirius's shoulder and changed the subject, smiling. "Forget that. Sirius, we should all go have a drink now." "Right. We need a good drink to celebrate," Sirius said with pride. He was pleased. Many English wizards still thought of Ireland as almost theirs. Hearing Sirius drop the money talk, Ron's face fell. For a brief private moment, he had already decided what he'd buy: a crumb poster, a photo album, maybe even a small statue souvenir. Now he could only watch Sirius and Arthur walk away. George, ever the practical one, pulled 2 shining galleons from his pocket and teased, "Here, Mama's little Ronnie." Ron blinked, stunned. Fred grabbed the coins away with a grin and swapped them for 2 sickles. Oh no! Ron's disappointment was more theatrical than real, but it stung. Mrs. Weasley, unable to watch her children bicker, intervened. She knew George's intentions. If he took money out, it was to give it to Ron, not to tease him. Fred, shrugging, handed both the galleons and the 2 sickles back to Ron, while George slipped a small Gringotts money bag into Ginny's hand without opening it. Harry watched the exchange with a twinge of envy, not for the coins, but for the family warmth on display. Mrs. Weasley noticed Harry's wistfulness at once. "Harry, why don't you stay at the Burrow before school starts? You can keep Ron company. He never does his homework, and I haven't seen him do any all summer." Harry was tempted. He would rather not go back to Aunt Petunia's. But he remembered Dumbledore's instructions and bit back his longing. "Sorry, I don't think I can accept, though I'd like to," he said, refusing with difficulty. Outside the boxes, the campsite remained a sea of celebration. Wizards from every nation mingled, their accents braided together as they traded stories and trinkets. After saying his farewells to Dumbledore and Newt, Eno wandered through the crowd at leisure. Jugglers, fireworks, and glowing baubles turned the place into an enchanted fair. "This is the World Cup I wanted," he thought, satisfied. Joy, he found, could be contagious. Standing amid the revelers, Eno vanished the way he often did, then reappeared a moment later with a candy stall balanced on his shoulder. "It's the start of the month. Xiao Di is asking for votes. Please vote. Thank you, everyone," he called, launching into his sales pitch. Starting today, Xiao Di will also share a little magic, anapneo. He explained to a curious cluster of listeners that anapneo was a simple healing spell used to clear someone's airway when they were choking on food. Professor Slughorn had once performed it in an emergency. Marcus had been so eager to answer Slughorn's question that he swallowed too quickly and began to choke. Slughorn had cleared his airway at once, and the spell's usefulness had become part of the gossip that made its rounds between tent poles and bonfires. As the night deepened, the World Cup's festivities rolled on, the field of magic and merriment stretching out under the stars. It's hard to picture what a camp of 100,000 people actually looks like, but tonight it was unmistakably alive. For over half an hour, Eno felt as if he'd wandered into a wizarding theme park. Even with restraint, he had spent nearly 10 galleons wandering the stalls. Magic lanterns, golden balloons, muggle detectors, rose-shaped brooches, tarot cards, moving star charts, moon globes. There were too many fascinating things, many of them illegal in England, yet for the World Cup, 100,000 witches and wizards had poured in. The Ministry of Magic had clearly relaxed its usual rules, So long as nothing too dangerous or large-scale was happening, they seemed willing to look the other way. "How much is this?" Eno asked, enunciating each syllable when he spotted something he'd always wanted, a flying carpet. It was tucked on the side of a little cart run by a middle-aged wizard with a bushy beard. His sunken eyes and prominent nose suggested he might be from the Middle East. He was cautious. The cart was cluttered with cheap sweets, and only one folded carpet hung at the edge like an ornament. Whether he couldn't speak English or simply didn't want to leave himself open to accusation, the seller's sales ritual was strange. When Eno asked the price, the wizard first held up 5 fingers, then, seemingly embarrassed, changed them to 4 and made a fist with his other hand. 40 galleons. Eno finally understood why flying carpets were restricted in England. They were ridiculously cheap compared to brooms. Carpets for dozens of galleons and brooms for hundreds or even thousands. If carpets flooded the market, who but Quidditch players would bother with brooms? He didn't haggle. Times were different now. He counted out 40 galleons and handed them over. The seller didn't reach for the money. He pointed to the cart, then stepped 3 meters away. "Ha! Good, good," he muttered, smiling as if that absolved him of everything. Eno couldn't help being amused. The man had perfected the art of plausible deniability. No conversation, no direct handling of the money, an entirely self-service exchange. Eno followed the instructions. His experience running a fortune-telling stall had taught him the precariousness of life at the bottom. The transaction completed smoothly. With the carpet rolled up under his arm, he went on. The carpet was an unexpected prize, but the real purpose of his stroll had been to see how fate would settle. 2 hours later, nearing midnight amid the festive camp, Eno realized he'd been worrying for nothing. There were no riots, no Death Eater attacks, only laughter and music. The result made sense in hindsight. Dumbledore's last public appearance had acted like a counterweight. Nothing seemed capable of tipping the balance against the tide of good cheer. The 422nd Quidditch World Cup in England had ended perfectly. The first ray of dawn rose gently in the east, and the brief interlude of revelry passed. Peaceful life was returning. Inside the black tent, Mrs. Weasley presided over breakfast. With Harry and Sirius among them, the family sat around the table, enjoying a proper meal, until an untimely voice came from outside. "They're mad! The whole Daily Prophet has gone mad," Arthur announced as he walked in, shaking his head. "Rita again?" Mrs. Weasley snapped. "Heaven knows how she gets those stories. This isn't secret messages this time. It's outright madness," Arthur sighed. The conversation drew everyone's attention. Sirius stood, took the newspaper Arthur had brought in, and began to laugh. "Pfft! Ha! They don't take Dumbledore's age into account, and yet they dare print this nonsense." He flattened the paper on the table so everyone could see. Ron read the headline aloud without meaning to. Dumbledore's illegitimate son left in the Muggle world. Merlin. A bold banner and a high-resolution photograph showed Dumbledore on a terrace, and beside him, Eno holding a phoenix. The angle and timing of the shot made their expressions look oddly similar. More than anything, proximity to either of them eased the nightmares and headaches he'd suffered before learning occlumency. The relief he'd felt near Dumbledore and near Eno had been unmistakable. Being close to them seemed to calm something inside him. Chapter 288, A Visit to Nicholas Flamel. The layout of the Daily Prophet had set the British Isles abuzz. Many dismissed it with a laugh. but a small, credulous segment of the population, likely the less discerning and lower-class wizards, took Rita Skeeter's words seriously. Even more significant, however, was an article that appeared in a wizarding academic journal and spread quietly through learned circles. Newt Scamander's essay, "Phoenixes Should Not Be Classified as Magical Beasts." Once published, it was reprinted by a number of specialty journals, Today's Transfiguration, Modern Wizard Development Studies, Potion Guide, and circulated among the academic community. It was not surprising. Phoenixes, mysterious even among magical creatures, had long resisted understanding. Their reproduction, their origin, even sightings were rare and fleeting. Yet everyone wanted to study them, rebirth, healing tears, the alchemical uses of their tail feathers, because the potential was enormous. Newt's piece, amplified by Rita's sensationalism, had thrust Eno into the eye of the storm. Eno, the man at the center of it all, paid little mind to the uproar. He carried a suitcase and walked the Champs-Élysées. What had once been a quiet stretch had become, by the 19th century, Paris's premier shopping avenue. He was not there to browse boutiques, though. He was there to visit a legend. Who would have thought that Nicholas Flamel, the alchemist said to have lived nearly 7 centuries, would be living in seclusion on the Champs-Élysées? When Fawkes had delivered the small note with an address, Eno's first reaction had been disbelief. He reasoned that when Nicholas first settled here, the street must have been little more than open land. After all, the avenue was only laid out in 1771 and renamed in 1789. Finding the Chanel flagship, he took the note from his pocket. The address seemed to shimmer in his hand, and the bustling commercial strip melted away as if erased by a spell. Before him stood a vast courtyard. On the gate a pair of eyes had been carved, unnervingly lifelike, fixed in an intense gaze. Despite the oddity, Eno held the note up casually. Like Muggle access control, the carved eyes closed at the sight of it, and the gate opened by itself. He did not step inside immediately. He paused in the doorway, inspecting the closed stone eyes. A moment ago, he had felt a flicker of life in them. That was strange. No matter how realistic a transfiguration, no matter how exquisite the alchemy, created things were essentially lifeless. Magic could not bring life where there was none, yet the spark he had felt suggested otherwise. 2 possibilities presented themselves. Either the accepted rules of magic were not as absolute as he had believed, or Nicholas Flamel possessed an alchemy of far greater subtlety. "This is interesting," he murmured, then crossed the threshold. As he passed the frame, the courtyard interior shifted. What had looked like a garden became a modern sitting room, complete with air conditioning vents, ceiling fans, a television, and crystal chandeliers. Before he could take it all in, an old voice called from within, "Welcome, young alchemist." Eno turned and saw Nicholas Flamel seated in a corner. He was not the spectral figure of legends, no frail crone or otherworldly visage, but an ordinary old man. White hair, a loose robe, a pale face that suggested he had not spent much time outdoors. He looked like a retiree who had grown used to the comfort of his home rather than a man who had lived through centuries. Eno bowed slightly and greeted him politely. "Good day, Mr. Flamel." "No need for formality. Please, sit," Flamel replied with a smile, motioning to a vacant sofa. He had received Dumbledore's letter months earlier and had learned of the young wizard who stood before him. Expecting an arrogant prodigy, he had been surprised by Eno's quiet composure and the unassuming manner with which he had approached the gate. The impression had in turn warmed him to the visitor. After Eno settled, a commotion arose from a distance. Looking toward the coffee table, he saw over a dozen tiny figures, no more than 3 inches tall, struggling to carry a teacup far larger than themselves. Their voices rose together as they hauled the weight. For a moment, the scene had the slapstick quality of a cartoon, Tom and Jerry in miniature, and it caught Eno's interest. These were not ordinary transfigured knickknacks or simple alchemical puppets. The little figures moved with a liveliness that suggested thinking minds. With coordinated effort, they had climbed the table, built a ladder of one another, and formed a 2-foot-tall giant that could grasp the oversized teacup and teapot easily. The success was short-lived. From the arm a piece slipped, the teapot tilted, and scalding water poured down onto the makeshift giant's feet. "Ow! Pull it up, it's scalding!" one of the tiny figures cried. Though he knew them to be creations, Eno's hand moved on impulse. He touched the table and felt the heat. At his touch, the water condensed and frosted, cooling instantly. "Phew! Saved!" the little figure exclaimed, voice trembling with lingering fear. Eno watched them, intrigued. These figures were nothing like wizards' chess pieces, which followed preset patterns. They displayed initiative, adapted to the situation, and reacted with real fear and relief. Eno realized what he was looking at was closer to what Muggles called artificial intelligence than to any simple transfiguration. They had thought, and they had a sense of self. The sight called to mind Hans Christian Andersen's tales, gentle, dreamlike stories of personified objects. Andersen's work, The Old Street Lamp, Thumbelina, The Teapot, The Ugly Duckling, The Princess and the Pea, had always given human qualities to the inanimate, and here, in Flamel's sitting room, those old enduring motifs felt suddenly alive. So many things only fear a change of fixed assumptions. Eno's mind ran through 1,000 possibilities at once, and an absurd, yet oddly plausible idea pushed its way forward. What if he was about to get the protagonist treatment again? He couldn't choose which fantasy world he entered, but he had a tool that could pinpoint worlds precisely, the same lifeline that had kept him alive before. The thought made a small smile curve his lips. The Brothers Grimm world had been the most generous he'd visited. There he had fully absorbed the flame of salvation, transformed disposable matches into an inexhaustible fire, and taken 2 epic grimoires from the tower, one about resurrection, the other about time. That was the sort of treatment a protagonist received. Across the table, Nicholas Flamel watched the tiny dolls and spoke softly. "Years and time are always fair. Perenelle and I gained long life, but we've lost so much. In the long flow of time, only these little fellows stay with me," he added with a faint, nostalgic sigh. Eno agreed, feeling the truth of it. When you live forever, you can't really be friends with ordinary people anymore. It's not just parting, it's like a curse time gives you. He thought of Middle-earth, Lily grown into a grandmother, Theoden aged, the young riders of Rohan who wouldn't stay young forever. If he ever went back, old friends might be gone and the young might have grown old. He didn't know that his words struck Flamel hard. "A curse bestowed by time," Flamel murmured, lost in the sentiment. 700 years had made him watch too many farewells. That slow procession had driven him toward a kind of half-seclusion. He flexed a fragile, pale hand as if to prove the burden was real. "Perhaps my curse is about to end. But—" He shook his head and then, with a smile, turned his gaze toward Eno. "Ha! In any case, I wish you a pleasant journey." Eno chuckled. He had the sense Flamel had guessed something about him, but there was nothing he wanted to hide. Otherwise, he wouldn't have echoed that lament. Not hiding was not confessing. It was simply being himself. Let Flamel guess if he pleased. What could guessing change? In the magic world, there might be wizards he couldn't defeat, but none here could threaten his life now. He thanked Flamel when the older man offered his blessing. Flamel returned his smile and watched the little dolls lining up and skiing across the table. The spill of tea had become a playground. Following Flamel's gaze, Eno touched the coffee table and, with a thought, turned it into a tiny winterland. A foot-high slide, a delicately carved carousel, a dozen seesaws in matching pairs, a miniature amusement park. The 3-inch figures rushed over at once. Flamel watched them fondly, then lifted his head. "I thought this meeting would be for guiding a junior," he said, "but I didn't expect to make a new friend on the eve of my departure." "It's my honor," Eno replied politely, and with a modest tilt added, "I'm also here to seek guidance in alchemy." At that directed mission, Flamel's hands came together in a pleased clap. A cabinet in the room opened by itself, and 2 ancient, leather-bound books drifted down onto the table. "These relate to the two-way mirror and the mirror of Erised," he said. "They were intended for bow batons, but after receiving a letter from Albus, I changed my mind. You should copy a set for yourself." "Thank you," Eno said, taking the books without hesitation. He'd managed to deduce the final alchemical formula for the film mirror with the bronze oil lamp, but he lacked the detailed steps. He had the answer, but not the method. That was why his film mirror functioned only as image storage and playback, not as a true television-like device. The books could fill in what the lamp hadn't shown. Flamel looked a little surprised. In his long life, he'd seen countless alchemists, and all had brightened at the sight of lost knowledge. The young man in front of him, however, had been oddly calm. "Does Hogwarts have related texts?" he asked, curious. "Hogwarts?" Eno blinked, but saw the meaning in Flamel's expression and answered quickly. "It's a talent of mine. I can see hidden things. I prepared a few documents beforehand." From his suitcase, he produced a parchment. It was a careful copy of a photograph he'd taken of Hermione holding a time-turner in the Halloween pumpkin carriage, transcribed and replicated exactly. He'd chosen the time-turner, rather than Ravenclaw's diadem, because understanding time was the key to unlocking the book about time. With a long life, many things could be gathered slowly. Time itself was foundational. Flamel's expression grew serious as he took in the parchment. The circular circuit and 12 distinct markings leapt out at him. With one look, he recognized the alchemical formula for the time-turner. "This is unexpected," he said, his tone threaded with new interest. He had assumed seeing hidden things, a curious party trick, but the diagram forced him to reevaluate the young man before him. Eno noticed the change in Flamel, too. After placing the parchment down, the older alchemist fell into quiet recollection. Eno felt no need to hurry. Instead, his eyes drifted back to the miniature park. Watching those lively dolls, he imagined using the film mirror to shoot a motion picture. Combining magical special effects with real tiny actors would be infinitely better than the stiff performances of the little wizards at the castle. 293. Incomplete top-level alchemical items. In a brief recollection, Nicholas Flamel drew up fragments from the depths of his memory. A moment passed. "You surprise me," he said. "I never expected anyone else in this world to have understood the time-turner so deeply." Though his voice trembled with feeling, a faint joy showed through. Eno frowned slightly. He had heard another meaning behind Flamel's words. "So deeply, you mean?" "Yes, it's incomplete." Flamel took over the explanation without hesitation. To be precise, every time-turner is incomplete. Like the Philosopher's Stone, all of these high alchemical items are flawed. Incomplete? Flawed? Eno's voice shot up a pitch. It wasn't just surprise at the volume. What Flamel said was absurd. An incomplete time-turner, an incomplete stone. The idea that every high-level alchemical device was a defective product was hard to imagine. What would a complete one even be like? Flamel chuckled softly. "You must have only ever studied one time-turner, like I did when I was about 200 years old." He looked as if he had been taken back to those years when, after decades of work, he thought he had finished unlocking the device, only to realize the sample he'd studied was itself defective. Every time-turner differs. Imagine taking a photograph of a working alarm clock. As time flows, each instant is different. Even if your shutter could click infinitely fast, each picture would differ from the next. Eno's understanding grew under Flamel's analogy, but new questions came up. If that's true, shouldn't there be a complete alarm clock behind those photos? There is. Flamel nodded and pointed at a clock in the room. The complete clock is the world's own flow of time. A time-turner is a projection of that flow. That's why you can't go back and change the past. Because a shadow is only a shadow. Eno finished for him. A time-turner is like a counterfeit pass that lets you step into time's house for a moment. There you can see and hear but cannot touch. And if the house's owner discovers the fake, the consequences are severe. He thought of the many wizards ruined by misuse of time-turners. "Seems you understand." Flamel picked up the parchment on the table. The alchemical circuits traced on it glowed faintly. "Which is why I say they're flawed. You can't reconstruct the clock from a single photograph. You can't manufacture a true time-turner." Eno frowned. "Then how did any time-turner come into existence?" "Who knows?" Flamel spread his hands with a rueful smile. "I'm not even 700 years old. Don't expect me to know all the secrets." "In that case, you're right." Eno wasn't surprised. Compared to the elves of Middle-earth, who lived thousands of years, 700 is not that old. Flamel's easy humor seemed less effective against him, and Flamel found the change slightly disorienting. He let the subject drop. "There's another incomplete item we could discuss, but later. It's time for my nap." He glanced again at the parchment. If the two-way mirror, or the mirror of Erist, had been only hints, the time-turner had placed the young man before him as an intellectual peer. And though this person seemed young, his true age might be older than he appeared. Eno didn't notice the shift in Flamel's tone. He only thought of the Philosopher's Stone at the mention of another incomplete item. He'd been surprised by Flamel's openness, then slightly proud of his own, having casually shown the Times-Turner's alchemical circuits. This was how alchemists traded ideas. At that very moment, across the sea in England, another nap produced a startling vision. At number 4, Privet Drive, Harry Potter jolted awake, gasping. After lunch, he'd gone back to his cupboard, keeping his distance from his aunt and uncle after recent events. With little else to do before school resumed, he often passed the afternoons napping. Today's nap, however, had shown him a terrifying scene from a first-person view. A dark wizard with an indistinct face slaughtering a muggle, the victim's body being swallowed by a python the size of a tree trunk. It was the same perspective as before, the same nightmare, but this time Harry decided not to keep it to himself. He sat up, unfurling a sheet of parchment, and carefully wrote down what he had seen and heard. When Hedwig flapped away with the letter, Harry hesitated, then copied the same account onto a second sheet before she flew off again. Far away in Paris, Nicolas Flamel woke from his short nap at the same moment. His body was fragile. He did not sit up. Instead, he turned his head and stared at the puppet standing by the bed, a 3-foot-tall automaton shaped like a 7- or 8-year-old boy. "Rick, I might have found a way for you to live," he said. The puppet cut him off. "My mission is to accompany you and Perenelle. She has already left. My mission is only to accompany you." Relief and guilt crossed Flamel's face. "Don't you want to live? Live?" A brief smile flickered across the puppet's features and vanished. "Have I ever truly lived?" 294. Half a month later, the separation, the years are like a song dusk. The sinking sun, like an old painter, used its richest colors to trace a magnificent scroll across the sky. Eno stood quietly by the window, watching. Today, he would say goodbye to Nicolas Flamel. Time had slipped by without him noticing. He had already spent more than half a month in France, and there was less than a week until Hogwarts term began. During his stay, he had exchanged alchemical knowledge with Flamel and learned many fascinating, little-known historical anecdotes. Life had been pleasant. The only regret was how few people there were to talk to. The house where Flamel lived seemed to be protected by the Fidelius charm. Under such potent concealment, not even owls could reliably find it, and a phoenix might fail as well. Fortunately, the loneliness had been only partial. On the third day after he arrived, Eno remembered another thing he'd almost forgotten: a real two-way mirror. After Hermione had given it to him, they had barely used it. The last time had been before the Quidditch World Cup, when Hermione called to invite him to watch. He had had a performance and had to decline. Before that, the mirror hadn't been used in so long he could hardly recall. Once he remembered, he made good use of it. Whenever he had free time, he would proactively chat with Hermione. Beyond Flamel, the only other company in the house were those small puppets that had been there from the start. Strangely, as the days passed, the puppets grew less lively, each one growing a little listless compared to before. After learning about the Philosopher's Stone, Eno understood why Flamel had called it incomplete. As one of alchemy's highest creations, the Philosopher's Stone is, in essence, a way to alter fundamental rules, like Gamp's law of elemental transfiguration. Where magic can't create food from nothing, a complete Philosopher's Stone contains the means to do exactly that. It wasn't just about conjuring one meal, it implied changing the rule itself. Magic cannot conjure food is a rule. Magic cannot bring the dead back is a rule. Magic cannot create life is a rule. The elixir of life was only one of the stone's less conspicuous powers. Flamel's stone, however, was so incomplete that only some of the faintest effects remained. It seemed that even the most exalted things carried imperfections. He was still lost in thought by the window when a clear voice called from beside him. "It's time to eat. Come with me." Eno looked down. A small puppet, no bigger than his hand, was tugging at his pant leg and looking up at him with an anxious, earnest face. Without hesitation, he crouched and lifted the palm-sized puppet into his cupped hands. This was one of the few still active puppets, the one that had been scalded by hot tea earlier. "Let's go eat," he told it. Holding the puppet, he followed it toward the dining room. Flamel's house looked like a modest residence from the outside, but inside it was as vast and confusing as a labyrinth. Doors opening at different times led to different rooms. Once, unaware of this, Eno wandered through dozens of rooms before a puppet guided him to his guest room. That puppet became his personal guide. Now it led him back to a familiar dining room. Flamel wasn't in his seat, which didn't surprise Eno much. The old man was frail and often took his meals in different places, usually drinking potions rather than eating. Tonight, on the day of departure, Flamel had been absent a moment, but then he entered the room slowly, accompanied by a puppet shaped like a small boy, about 3 feet tall, who carried an old-looking suitcase. "Good evening, Mr. Flamel." Eno set down his cutlery and wiped his mouth with a napkin. "For a moment there, I thought you weren't going to see me off." "How could I?" Flamel chuckled, nodding toward the box the puppet carried. "I was just arranging your farewell gifts. These are books for you. Leaving them at Beaubaton would only mean they'd end up on some high shelf. Better you have them." "In that case, thank you. When I've read them, I'll copy them and send them to Beaubatons," Eno said. He didn't intend to keep the knowledge to himself. "As you wish. I've done enough for my alma mater," Flamel replied, smiling. "The reason I was late was him. He's shy, but I wanted you to meet him." "This is Rick," Flamel continued. "He's been with me for over 500 years. I hope that after I'm gone, someone will remember him." Later, in Hogsmeade, a flash of orange-red light brought Eno back to the little cottage he had not visited in a long time. A sharp voice piped up, and Eno reached into his long pocket to find a small head peeking out. "Yes, it's your home now," it chirped. He set the small puppet gently on the bed, but when he looked at it, his thoughts drifted back to Rick. He had half expected Flamel to entrust Rick to him. Instead, the meeting had been merely an introduction. Flamel, who had used his life in some way to sustain those puppets, had practiced forbidden alchemy of a kind. Yet what was lost could not be restored. The incomplete Philosopher's Stone had already left its mark at the end of Flamel's life. Eno smiled quietly. It was not his place to judge another's choices. His gaze fell on the desk calendar. Time had seemed to stop at the moment he left France. With a soft snap of his fingers, the pages began to turn and finally settled on the 27th, August 27th, 1994. "It's the first day of the month. Please vote, please vote, please vote." Today's entry, Philosopher's Stone. The Philosopher's Stone is a man-made red stone with magical properties. It can be used to create the elixir of life, which extends the drinker's life, and it can also transmute any metal into pure gold. The renowned alchemist Nicholas Flamel created the only known Philosopher's Stone by 1991. He used it to make the elixir of life, extending his and his wife Perenelle's lives for over 6 centuries. 295. One man's alchemy factory. Sometimes not everyone chooses solitude. Most people are simply forced by circumstance to learn how to be alone. In a small cottage in Hogsmeade, in a second-floor bedroom, Eno had just used transfiguration to make a life-sized bed for one of the little dolls and a set of matching mini furniture. When he finished, he opened another suitcase, a gift from Nicholas Flamel. The case was made from the hide of a Thibaut warthog. The design looked almost medieval, but it was extremely practical. Thibaut warthogs are prized magical creatures. Their hides have long been used for shields and even for invisibility cloaks. Compared with cloaks woven from Demagoy's hair, those made of Thibaut warthog hide are rarer, likely because of their exceptional defensive properties. Flamel had left the invisibility property unused, perhaps because it was only a suitcase, but that didn't bother Eno. He had meant to replace his old luggage for a long time. This was a high-end piece that only needed a few tweaks, and it would far outclass his old case in concealment and protection. But that could wait. For now, he was curious about what Flamel had packed inside. He opened the suitcase, climbed down a small ladder, and stepped into an extension charm space tucked within. It was not large, only a few dozen square meters, about the size of one room. The furnishing was spare, 2 walnut bookshelves against the walls. One of the 10-foot shelves was crammed with books in old covers. The other held dozens of small dolls in various shapes. Eno recognized them. They were the little fellows who had once served tea and water. But they did far more than fetch drinks. From past conversations with Flamel, he knew their capabilities. They could do laundry, cook, and manage household chores, much like house elves, and they could act as superb alchemy assistants. Some could even craft alchemical items by themselves. So why were they just lying quietly on a shelf? A sealed letter placed beside the bookshelf answered that question. Eno took it up reluctantly. By the time he finished reading, he understood Flamel's reasoning, and understood why these alchemist-like dolls had not been donated to Beauxbatons as an inheritance. "It really is equivalent exchange," he murmured. The dolls were not driven purely by magic, like wizard's chess. They required the philosopher's stone, more precisely, life force. A wizard had to exchange a year of his own life to grant a year of vitality to a doll. That kind of price explained why Flamel had been unwilling to hand them over. Life for life, not everyone could afford it. If they were mere toys, fine, no one would risk years of life for playthings. But these dolls were close to being full alchemists. If they circulated freely, the number of missing wizard cases would likely soar. Despite the grim cost, Eno felt a surge of excitement. The dolls were almost tailor-made for him. In the kind of story world he inhabited, time behaved oddly. There was a loop, a reset. If he went into that fantasy world and spent decades of his life to vitalize dozens of dolls, the hit would only be temporary. When the story ended, he would revert to his original state. It was a loop he could exploit calmly, far more comfortably than Flamel had. He could let the dolls exist indefinitely without long-term loss. "Why bother building an alchemy factory?" he said with a grin. "I'll be a mobile factory. With those little workers, he wouldn't have to painstakingly recruit and train alchemists. He could mass-produce film mirrors, and if he wanted, even try to break into other alchemical markets. The wand market, for example. But that was idle ambition for later. For now, like his work on the film mirror, his aim was simple: make the magical world a more interesting place. If his goal were only galleons, he wouldn't have bothered to gather so many people to help earlier. About half an hour later, he climbed out of the suitcase's extension space. Night had fallen. The window looked out over a peaceful Hogsmeade. A few lights glowed in rows of cottages, making the village look cozy. After one last look at the view, Eno went straight to his bed. More than half a month of travel had made him crave sleeping at home. Morning came with a crisp tapping. Eno opened his eyes to an unfamiliar owl perched by the window. He opened the sash to let the messenger in, and then noticed several letters already stacked on the windowsill, accumulated mail from his time traveling in France. He tidied them and set a bowl of water and some nuts for the owl. As it pecked happily, he saw the wax seal on one envelope, a large letter H stamped in red. The color suggested the current headmistress might be Gryffindor, he thought. He opened the envelope. It was his fourth-year enrollment form. Most of the textbooks hadn't changed, though some core materials had been updated. Standard Book of Spells, Intermediate, Intermediate Transfiguration, Intermediate Potions, and so on. Fourth year already, Eno said to himself, a little dazed. 3 years had flown by before he noticed. He remembered secretly practicing the fire-making spell alone under a bridge as if it had been yesterday. Time passed and things changed, whether he was ready or not. He glanced at the other letters on the sill. One was from Newt Scamander, largely discussing the academic world's reaction to the birth of a phoenix. Some researchers had already begun to study it. Eno scoffed at the idea. Phoenix fire, he knew, required a singular purity of emotion to condense into a core. Trying to manufacture it would be impossible. Forcing it would create Zanin that killed the core. The known phoenixes were born of pure, undeniable emotions. Spark's flame came from a Quidditch player's unbroken persistence. Fawkes from the selfless sacrifice of Dumbledore's ancestor. Fide from an extreme, fateful sorrow in a delicate dance of snow. Corvus from the hope for peace felt by tens of thousands in Rohan. Any trace of impure thought would block the formation of the flame's core. He set Newt's letter aside and opened the next envelope. It was from Harry. Short and plain, the letter described a dream. A dark wizard, his face indistinct, killed a muggle, and the muggle was swallowed by a python. Chapter 296, Trelawney's Prophecy. Dumbledore's death time slipped by unnoticed. September 1st, 1994. At King's Cross Station, the Hogwarts Express idled on the tracks. Countless newly admitted young witches and wizards moved about with their families, eyes wide with curiosity and a faint, eager excitement. Hogwarts was a place every young magic user longed for, whether from muggle or wizarding stock. For those from wizarding families, it was something they'd heard about their whole lives but rarely seen. Platform 9 and 3/4. Eno passed through the barrier alone, and the familiar sight beyond it brought a quiet ease. The feeling faded quickly, replaced by a cool, neutral awareness. He glanced around. Dozens of curious eyes watched him, sizing him up. They were restrained, though. No one rushed forward to bother him. Fame carried a price, and he had learned to tolerate being watched. After a polite smile, he headed for the train. He didn't mind attention, but he had no wish to be anyone's mascot. Eno, a familiar voice called from not far away. Eno stopped and turned. Long time no see, Harry. Phew, I finally found you. Harry let out a long breath. His voice was slightly hoarse. He was in that voice-changing phase. Waiting for me? Eno raised an eyebrow. A few days earlier, he'd read a letter that made him think of Harry's anxiety, and the memory surfaced. Harry, really, you don't need to worry. You're perfectly safe at Hogwarts. I'm not questioning Hogwarts, Harry said. I just always feel a bit uneasy. Harry's face showed an apologetic strain. The dream he'd had during his nap had been too vivid, and it kept bringing to mind the dying muggle's eyes. All right, but this isn't a good place to talk. Let's get on the train first. Eno saw Harry's fear and found it understandable. Without the training he'd received in the past 2 years, Harry was still essentially a 15-year-old boy. After witnessing a murder scene, lingering shadows were only natural. It also made Eno wonder. Without that training, would Harry have the courage to face Voldemort as he had in the original sequence of events? It was a worrying thought. On board the Hogwarts Express, Eno and Harry found an empty compartment. They ignored the usual, unspoken separations between houses. Gryffindor and Slytherin didn't have the same bitter enmity they once had. House rivalry existed, but it lacked the fierce edge it used to. Eno settled in, and Harry, unusually relaxed now that they were inside, let out a small sigh of relief. Eno, Harry began, that dream really left me on edge. I keep feeling like something might happen this year. Eno, you should leave predicting the future to Professor Trelawney, Eno joked, but Harry's next words made him sit up. That charlatan, don't even mention her. Harry's voice rose involuntarily at Trelawney's name. She made a prophecy about me. Eno's curiosity piqued. Trelawney, with whatever seer blood she had, sometimes said things that turned out true. What did she say? She made a ridiculous prophecy. Anger creased Harry's face. Before summer break, after the last divination class, that madwoman stopped me and told me I would kill Professor Dumbledore, and Eno's interest chilled. At first, the idea sounded absurd, but when he put the right pieces together, the thought wasn't entirely impossible. If Harry were ever influenced by the remnant of Voldemort's soul in his scar, briefly taken over, and attacked Dumbledore, the old headmaster's refusal to harm Harry could create circumstances where the prophecy came true. Voldemort could never defeat Dumbledore outright, but he was hardly weak or incompetent. The possibility made Eno uneasy. If things escalated that far, he wouldn't mind being seen as the villain to prevent a worse outcome. It's crazy, Harry insisted, flushed with frustrated indignation. How could I ever harm Professor Dumbledore? Before Eno could answer, the compartment door opened. You too. Draco Malfoy stood in the corridor, dressed smartly. He had heard Eno was in this carriage and come looking for him. Each year, the same small group used to sit together at the start of term. The sight inside left Draco slightly flustered. Harry's flushed face, Eno's composed smile. Eno watched Draco's expression and thought that, as the boy grew up, his thoughts had become less innocent. Malfoy, what are you planning to do to Harry? Ron called from the corridor. Hermione and Ginny stood behind him. Unlike Ron's bluntness, Hermione and Ginny exchanged a look of discomfort at what they'd walked into, each seeing in the other an awkwardness that seemed hard to resolve. All right, let's stop this, Eno said decisively, standing. Harry, don't overthink it. No one actually believes Trelawney's prophecies. He took Draco by the arm and left. He didn't want to stay where rumors might begin. Ron's loud voice in the corridor had already drawn many heads out of compartments. God knew how quickly something like this would spread through the castle after the opening feast. After Eno left, the three Gryffindors climbed into the compartment. Harry, what prophecy? You never told me, Ron complained, feeling slighted, used to being the first to hear everything from his friend. The Hogwarts Express always fulfilled its mission. The old steam train had once again delivered all the young witches and wizards to their destination. As the Thestrals came to a halt, Eno jumped down from the carriage and followed the path toward the front gates of the castle. But unlike other years, a crowd of first years had gathered outside the entrance, many of them cursing loudly, clutching their heads, and then bravely rushing toward the castle. Goyle, go see what's happening, Draco ordered, before Eno could say a word. Draco didn't intend to go forward himself. A sensible Slytherin wouldn't expose himself to danger. Eno was pleased. Compared to Harry's lack of training, Draco had improved at least a little from the original story. As Goyle started forward, a water balloon fell from the sky and burst at the castle entrance with a loud pop, soaking the gathered students. That blasted Peeves! A chorus of curses rose. But the complaints only brought more water balloons and high-pitched, mischievous laughter. Eno looked up and saw, about 15 feet above the entrance, a short, ridiculous figure in a bell-shaped hat, clutching more water balloons. "Ha! You little brats! Since you won't come in, Peeves will come out to greet you. Take that!" Peeves laughed and hurled a blue balloon into the crowd. It burst and caused another small commotion. Seeing that Peeves had no intention of stopping, Eno decided not to stand idly by. He stepped forward, and the students parted for him. Peeves prepared to throw another balloon, but when it clearly saw who was coming, its big eyes rolled, and it made a disgruntled noise. Tsk! Boring. Uncharacteristically, it turned and flew off. Everyone nearby was surprised, and Eno was no exception. From diligent history of magic classes, he knew Peeves, born in the castle, and feared by nearly everyone except the Bloody Baron. Even some professors couldn't always stop Peeves' pranks. Still, he didn't dwell on it. The wizarding world was full of strange things. After Peeves left, the blocked students entered the Great Hall in orderly fashion. The hall itself seemed redecorated. The candles looked brighter, and a ring of delicate magical lamps had been lit around the room. Eno found a nearby seat and sat at the Slytherin table with a calm mind. A low, hoarse voice came from behind him. "Peeves actually fears you." The Bloody Baron stood there, gaunt and pale in a long robe stained with silver blood, the shackles of his repentance visible. The Baron was a reserved presence. He rarely appeared and often wandered the castle's dark passages alone. "I was curious myself," Eno replied. "But a poltergeist fearing a wizard, well, isn't that normal, Mr. Eno?" "Baron? Normal?" The Baron's tone carried an unreadable note. Then he walked through the stone behind him and vanished. By the time Eno turned back, the sorting ceremony had begun. Professor McGonagall led the new students from the side hall into the Great Hall under everyone's gaze. The newcomers were silent and reserved, and the older students watched with indulgent smiles. History, it seemed, repeated itself every year. The Sorting Hat's off-key song rang out as always. By now, Eno was less curious about the hat's sentience. Enchanted objects and creations that thought for themselves were not unique in the wizarding world. McGonagall finished the list, and to Eno's surprise, Slytherin had broken the 40-student mark. Back in Harry's year, the house had taken only 29 new students. Eno clapped softly for the new arrivals. When McGonagall replaced the hat, Dumbledore rose at the head table and looked out at the students with a smile. "I am very happy, very happy. We are gathered here once again, and I have only one command." He tapped his wand once in the air and announced, "Eat." The long tables, which had moments before been bare, were instantly piled with food. "Finally, we can eat," someone called. Eno glanced over and saw it was Crabbe. He was used to such antics. In Slytherin, the real glutton was more likely to be Goyle, Eno thought, while Crabbe affected stupidity for effect. Eno picked up his fork but did not eat at once. Through the tines, he saw the familiar silver-white shapes of ghosts floating in the Great Hall. Little things from the afternoon kept coming back to him. Peeves' odd obedience, the Baron speaking when he normally kept to himself. They were small, harmless anomalies, but together they hinted at something different happening at Hogwarts. He also recalled the prophecy Trelawney had mentioned in the train compartment, the one Harry had brought up. For a moment, he wanted to go straight to the headmaster's office and ask what Dumbledore had been doing over the summer, but the sight of the old headmaster here at the table, smiling and cutting the food on his plate, quieted him. Dumbledore seemed in good spirits. Eno decided to wait. He speared a piece of steak and ate slowly, planning to visit the headmaster's office after dinner. 298. Tri-Wizard Tournament. The start of the feast also marked the beginning of a new school year at Hogwarts. Everything seemed to be back on track. The long Gryffindor table piled with food, the candles floating above, and the chatter of students catching up after the holidays. Ron immediately set to work, ravenous after a long day on the train. He held a large chicken leg in one hand and a spoon in the other, shoveling plate after plate of parsley and garlic mashed potatoes into his mouth. Watching him eat, nearly headless Nick drifted through the air nearby with a look of thinly veiled envy. As a ghost, Nick couldn't taste a thing. He could only watch. "If you ask me, you lot are very lucky," Nick said sourly. "Tonight's feast nearly went down the drain." Ron merely munched on, not much interested, but Harry, curious, turned to him. "Oh, what happened?" "There was a terrible mess in the kitchens this afternoon," Nick said with a heavy sigh. He rolled in midair, the sliver of skin keeping his head attached, trembling as he spoke. "Peeves went completely mad, spent the whole afternoon making a scene." "And why would Peeves do that?" Ron asked, interested now. Rumors in the castle were useful, especially for someone who liked to have something to talk about. Nick floated closer. "Well, he was chased out by the Bloody Baron, as usual. Peeves has this long-standing desire to be at the feasts. We all thought he'd given it up after a while, but he took to it again. The kitchen was a right mess." "Blimey," Ron said, half listening and half filling his plate. The conversation petered out as the feast carried on with clatter and laughter. An hour later, Dumbledore rose from the high table. "All right, I think you should all be full by now." At his signal, the remaining platters, half-finished drinks and plates vanished in a blink, and the long house tables were left spotless. 2 whole hours, Draco muttered beside Eno, like feeding a teacup pig. Eno heard the complaint but said nothing. What was a banquet for some was everyday fare for others. Perspectives changed everything. Slytherin had its share of wealthier families and house elves, but not everyone. That might explain why the feast went on so long tonight. At the high table, Dumbledore went through the usual warnings. No wandering into the forbidden forest, no dangerous toys in the castle, and so on, allowing Filch to add the more particular penalties for rule breaking. He cast a pointed look toward the Gryffindor table when he mentioned mischief makers. The Weasley twins exchanged guilty but innocent glances that made Dumbledore's twinkling eyes crinkle with amusement. "Besides that," Dumbledore continued, "I'm sorry to inform you that Hogwarts will not be holding the Quidditch House Cup this year." The announcement exploded through the hall like a depth charge. "What? How dare he?" Draco slammed his fist on the table, failing to care about decorum. Quidditch mattered to many of them, and the cancellation sparked a rising roar of protests. Voices rose until Dumbledore raised his hands and made a calming downward motion. The noise died down. "The cessation of Quidditch," Dumbledore explained, "is because a large event will begin this October and will continue through the school year. We must make the necessary adjustments." A murmur of anticipation met those words. "I believe you will find this event most enjoyable, and I am honored." Before he could finish, urgent thumping noises at the Great Hall doors interrupted him. All heads turned. The doors burst open, and an old man limped in, leaning on a specially reinforced cane. He slammed the cane on the floor as he entered, the dull impact echoing in the suddenly silent room. Under the candlelight, everyone could see him plainly, hair gone sparse and gray, a face scarred and lined with years of hardship. But the most striking thing was his eyes. One was a normal brown gaze, the other was a magical, pale blue orb that turned and scanned the room on its own. "Mad Eye," came whispers around the hall. "Could it be him?" someone breathed. Alastair Moody ignored the whispers. As one of the most famed aurors in England, he was used to attention and having people talk. His magical eye swung around the Great Hall, taking everything in. It stopped for a moment on Eno. Rather than looking away, Eno gave a polite smile and let his eyes drift elsewhere. He'd seen enough to be wary of direct, unblinking stares. In that brief exchange, inwardly noting the steadiness beneath Moody's gruff exterior, Eno felt certain this was the real Mad-Eye rather than some imposter. Wizards' instincts were not foolproof, but they were often useful. What puzzled Eno more than Moody's arrival was Dumbledore's arrangement. Hogwarts was large, but staff positions were limited, and there were no empty teaching posts. If Moody had come to teach, where would the headmaster put him? 299. Moody's arrangement. The great hall at Hogwarts fell into a hush. As Eno lowered his eyes, Moody shifted his gaze as well. The old wizard leaned on his cane and limped up to the staff table. To be fair, although he favored the cane, Moody's pace wasn't much slower than a normal person's. If anything, it had a briskness to it. Under everyone's stare, Dumbledore rose to meet him, clasping Moody's hand. After a brief exchange, the headmaster turned back to the students below the dais. "For reasons I must interrupt our previous announcement," Dumbledore said, pausing for effect. "I have the honor of introducing a gentleman to you." Moody made no move to stand and bow, so Dumbledore continued. "Due to the increasing demands on our care of magical creatures professor, Rubus Hagrid, the 12 governors of Hogwarts have unanimously agreed to appoint an additional gamekeeper." "That's right." "From this year forward, Mr. Alastor Moody will serve as Hogwarts' gamekeeper." Only scattered applause answered Dumbledore's words. Whether Muggle-born students judging on appearance or those who knew Moody's reputation, few welcomed the new appointment. His entrance had been brusque, and his reputation, paranoid, obsessive, almost like a dark wizard without the crime, preceded him. As if to prove it, Moody sat down at the staff table, produced his wand and clenched it in his hand, then took several different models of sneakoscopes from his pockets and set them out like pieces in a game of wizard chess. The sight startled everyone. Even Dumbledore gave a wry shake of his head. "All right, let us return to our previous topic." Dumbledore's voice cleared. "The Quidditch House Cup will not be held this year. Instead, we will revive a famous competition that has been dormant for over a century. Yes, I am delighted to announce that the Triwizard Tournament, suspended for more than 100 years, will be held this year, here at Hogwarts. The Goblet of Fire has been lit. This competition represents the undying glory of 3 great magical schools of Europe." Dumbledore delivered the announcement without theatrics, but the students reacted as if it were the most exciting news in the world. Those who knew what the Triwizard Tournament entailed were electrified. Those who did not were swept up in the excitement. "Glorious," a few voices echoed. At the Gryffindor table, Ron nodded enthusiastically. Harry poked his arm. "Ron, what is the Triwizard Tournament?" he asked. "Oh, the Triwizard Tournament is brilliant," Ron answered before Harry could finish, flaring with pride and a touch of guilt. "Don't ask him. Can't you see the guilty look plastered on his face?" Hermione cut in mercilessly from across the table. "Hey," Ron bristled, but he didn't press the point. He knew that if the argument continued, he might be forced into explaining or revealing that he didn't know as much as he pretended. Hermione launched into a rapid explanation. It started in the 13th century. Each of the 3 schools selects a champion to represent them in a series of dangerous tasks. The champion wins a large prize, and their name is inscribed forever in the Goblet of Fire. Fame, wealth, glory, and adventure. What more could you want? By the end of her lecture, Harry and the other Gryffindors had a good idea of what the tournament meant. Money, fame, the chance to be champion. Those ideas ignited a longing in the half-grown witches and wizards around the table. Even Ron, who'd tried to downplay his interest, was listening intently. At the Slytherin table, the mood was different, far more composed. Most of the upper-year Slytherins fixed their attention on one boy. "Eno, this is made for you," Draco said with an expression that mixed congratulation and challenge. His posture screamed confidence. He looked like someone who intended to take the glory. Eno smiled politely, but was more curious about Dumbledore's other announcements than about the tournament itself. He deflected Draco's enthusiasm with a small comment. "I might have to miss part of term in October." "You're leaving school?" Draco's voice shot up, drawing nearby Slytherin's attention. "Yes." Eno inclined his head. "I've received a reply from the Order of Merlin. There are duties I must attend to." He didn't elaborate, but Draco, along with Pansy and Daphne and others nearby, already guessed the meaning. An Order of Merlin award carried tremendous prestige in wizarding society. In some ways, it seemed more significant than the Goblet of Fire. "That's a shame," Draco said with conflicting tones, disappointed, yet oddly pleased. "But congratulations, you can still enter the tournament if you want. Maybe you'll even make the Malfoy name proud." "I'll pass," Draco replied with a shrug, trying to sound indifferent. "I'm not risking myself for glory." Eno was unapologetically calm. He had reason to believe Hogwarts' time champion would likely be one of their own, regardless of who tried. His observations from the Transfiguration Club and his estimation of Cedric's abilities convinced him of that. Although only a sixth year, Cedric already possessed skills beyond many adults, adept at transfiguration and quick of mind. If anyone deserved to be Hogwarts champion, it would be Cedric. As Eno pondered, Draco idly scanned the hall. News of the tournament had electrified the students. The Great Hall buzzed with anticipation. This wasn't a routine, once every 5 years event. This was the first Goblet of Fire in over a century. It seemed few could resist the pull of such an honor. 300, hidden room in the principal's office. Time slipped away quietly. After Dumbledore announced the end of the feast, the students of the 4 houses returned to their dormitories in an orderly line, led by their prefects. Of course, that procession included the ritual of singing the school song in unison. Outside the Great Hall, while everyone chattered about the Triwizard Tournament, Eno turned and headed for the stairs. The 6 Slytherin prefects, 2 each from 5th, 6th, and 7th years, made no move to intervene. Privilege was on full display. Nearby, Gryffindor and Ravenclaw students rode the moving staircase side by side, red and blue taking up their halves of the steps, green trailing behind. Hermione and Cho, oddly enough, seemed to be doing a kind of moonwalk, appearing to step forward while actually backing away. "Eno, how did you get here?" 2 voices called at the same time and then fell silent. Hermione looked up in surprise. When she saw Cho, she relaxed. They all belonged to the Transfiguration Club, so Hermione knew Cho well enough. Cho, who had a boyfriend, carried a faint shyness now, like she'd been sneaking a drink for a friend, but the feeling flickered and was gone. "I'm just going to see Professor Dumbledore," Cho said, and Eno didn't try to hide his plan. "All right, don't forget Wednesday's club. I have to go back." Cho noticed several Ravenclaws glancing back and, after a hurried word, slipped back with her group. Hermione, unbothered by gossip, let them go. "It's not about the Triwizard Tournament," she said to Eno. "I have a few things I want to discuss with Professor Dumbledore." They rode the moving staircase together, Hermione talking and Eno listening, responding where needed. All journeys end. On the 8th floor, Eno's destination was the headmaster's office. Hermione followed the Gryffindor line down the other corridor. A few minutes later, Eno stood before the familiar stone gargoyle. It turned on its own, as it always did, and opened the secret passage before he reached it. He'd been surprised the first time the gargoyle moved 2 years ago. By now, he'd grown used to its quirks. He often joked about the office's strange security, like a husky as doorman, and thought of how the official appointment in the original story had had the support of the ministry and the governors, yet Dolores Umbridge had never managed to get through that door. He reached out and patted the gargoyle's head as he passed. Through the passage and along the connecting corridor, Eno arrived at the headmaster's office. Dumbledore didn't seem to have come straight back after the feast, so Eno sat on the sofa and waited. The office was quiet. Even the usually talkative portrait of Principal Black was snoring, and the whole room had settled into a deep hush. Eno closed his eyes and dozed a little. Meanwhile, down in the Gryffindor common room, the house was alive. "I've decided. I'm going to compete," Ron announced with great dignity. Harry nodded instinctively. The others paid him little heed. "How will they choose the champion? Drawing lots? If you ask me, they should have a wizard chess match to pick the champion," Ron said, stroking his chin like a man giving careful counsel. "Then I'd rather have a Quidditch match," Harry shot back. "Oh, come on, Rony. Your ideas make me laugh." George appeared, carrying a large tray of butterbeer, selling it to the crowd. "Laugh? What's so funny?" Ron protested, though he knew wizard chess was probably a ridiculous suggestion. He changed tack. I was wondering, if you and Fred are that rich, why do you sell these things? He hadn't forgotten the Quidditch World Cup, when Ginny had opened her purse and it bulged with dozens of galleons. Do you really have to make money from this? He pressed. Fred materialized behind him. We do it for the fun of it, he said, and we haven't added a nut to the price. By the way, Harry, this one's on me. He handed Harry a can of butterbeer. And mine? I'm your brother. Ron's eyes widened when he realized he hadn't been served. Oh, brother. George took a can from the tray and offered it to Ron. That'll be 3 sickles. At the mention of money, Ron's smile froze. Back at the headmaster's office, time crept by. Eno checked the clock, 10:30 p.m. He decided not to wait any longer. Corvus, he called softly. A burst of warm light heralded the arrival of a beautiful orange-red phoenix. Eno rose to take him, just about to tell Corvus to take him back to the dormitory, when an oval archway of shimmering light appeared in one wall of the office. He hesitated and turned his head away. The headmaster's portrait was absent, and the owner of the office wasn't present. Yet he couldn't help glancing back. As he reached down for Corvus, an old voice, neither unfriendly nor hostile, sounded in the room. I thought you'd be a little curious, but you're leaving so decisively. A soft recorded voice followed, like a monthly bulletin projecting from the archway. It's the beginning of the month. Xiao Di is asking for votes. Votes, votes, votes. Big shots. Please cast a vote. Xiao Di's sharing today. Demaguise. The projection continued, giving a short encyclopedia-style entry. British Ministry of Magic Classification Level. Origin and distribution. Demaguises are generally found in the Far East. Appearance. Demaguises resemble graceful apes with long, silky silver hair and large black eyes, often hidden behind their fur, giving them an expression of delicate sadness. Habits. They are gentle, quiet, herbivorous, magical creatures. Abilities and use. Demaguises can become invisible when threatened and possess a limited gift of short-term foresight, making them difficult to spot. Only wizards experienced in capturing them can reliably see them. Their fur is highly prized. Strands of Demaguise hair can be woven into invisibility cloaks. However, such cloaks will lose their transparency over time and eventually cease to render the wearer invisible. Related knowledge. Because of their invisibility, the Demaguise represents the number 0 in the runes alphabet. As the little bulletin finished, the archway's light dimmed. The phoenix shifted on Eno's arm, and the office sank back into its quiet.